Hey guys, welcome back. We have our next lecture in our series today on the Industrial Revolution, and today we are going to be talking about the railroad. So we've all heard stories about the railroads being built across America. Today we're going to talk about how they were actually built, the impact that it had on our country, and in particular the ability of the railroads to really grow the economy of this country and really led to the rise of the first big businesses. So we are going to get started. So once again, you need to get your notes out. You need to be filling out notes as you watch. And as always, please make sure that you are asking questions along the way by writing those questions out in the margin and then either sending me an email or posting on any discussion boards if you do have questions, and I'd be happy to get back to you. So let's go, and I promise today's lecture will not be nearly as long as last time. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I like to show a lot of maps. Again, I'm really big on geography, really demonstrating and kind of explaining how history is shaped. And I think these two maps in particular do a great job of showing you exactly what we're talking about here. So again, the railroads, you look at the impact that the railroads had from about 1861, over 3 decades, less than 3 decades, we laid down 210,000 miles worth of railroad tracks. If you look at the map on the left, you got 1850. You can see the railroad lines. I mean, they're not really even making their way into Missouri yet, and we're about 10 years out of the Civil War at this point. You look at the map on the bottom right, and that's, I believe, towards the end of the 1860s. I could be wrong. It may be later than that. Actually, you know what? I think that is 1890. So that's about the time period from that statistic. But you look at the complex web of all these railroad lines and where they are going. So, this is something that truly transformed our country. And you think about all the different impacts it would have. Not only is it going to be easier for goods to get across country, but farmers to get their food to populations out east, but also it's going to be easier for people to travel. For the most part throughout our country's history, most people never traveled more than 10 miles away from their home. That is going to start to change here with the railroads. It's going to be faster. It's going to be easier to travel, and that's a little bit of we're going to touch on that just a little bit later on in the lecture. All right. Well, it all had to start somewhere. In 1869, they completed the first transcontinental railroad. So the first railroad that was connected from East Coast to West Coast. They had a big ceremony. You can see the picture down in the bottom left. Very famous photograph as the two lines basically came to a point. It was kind of a race. There were 3 major companies that were building this railroad line: the Western Pacific, Central Pacific, and Union Pacific Railroad companies. And basically, they were racing for tax dollars. The government was paying these companies by the mile to place railroad tracks, and so they were racing. Those that started in the east were building west as fast as they could, and same with those in the west building east to basically lay down as many miles as they could to get as much tax dollars from the government. They ended up meeting in 1869 at a place called Promontory Point. The picture in the bottom right there, you could see kind of the symbolic final nail going into the railroad line there. In fact, it was actually a golden spike that he is hammering into the railroad line, which of course they immediately took out and then put on display in a museum. But 1869 is where things are going to start changing quite a bit, with the country being connected from sea to shining sea. Last time we talked about manifest destiny, how we were kind of fated to reach the Pacific, and now we are connected with the Pacific, with the West Coast. So everything starts to change after 1869. All right, well, who was building the railroads? And you probably have heard some stories about this, but, for the most part, it was immigrant labor that was being used to build the railroads, especially those companies that had started out west and were moving eastward. A lot of Asian immigration to places like California and Oregon. And out east, you had a lot of Irish that were being used to build the railroads, and also note many Civil War veterans. Within a few years after the Civil War, you had many veterans returning back from the war that, frankly, they had either, especially if they were Southerners, they had lost their farms potentially, they had lost their homes, but many of them were unemployed, and so this was a good steady employment for them. Now, one thing I always like to bring up here is, you look at, and you can imagine the level of racism that was involved. But you can see that Chinese, on average, Chinese immigrants were actually making about half of what a white worker was making at the time. So there's definitely some racist policies within this that, and it would just continue to get worse. We'll talk about laws that get passed here in which they basically try to ban all Chinese from even coming into the country. But anyway, so our history, I talked last time a little bit about how, there's a lot of things to be prideful of in American history, but there's also a lot of problems, and we need to talk about some of those, darker chapters in our history if we're able to learn from them at all. So, this is one of those. Here we treated these workers as half as good, and sometimes, many times, they were actually twice as good at workers. But it's something that we continually try to get better at with some of these policies, and but definitely something that we need to learn from here. It was dangerous work. One reason so many immigrants did sign up for this is that they had trouble finding jobs elsewhere. But it was dangerous work. This is not highly in demand. And I guess I should go back. I shouldn't mention, those salaries. You might think, well, that's pretty low. $2 a day or something on the high side of that. You got to remember that inflation has really taken off over the last really 100 years, but in particular over the last 50, really. And so that actually was a somewhat decent wage for the time, but still very, very dangerous work. And you can tell that in 1 year alone, 1888, working on the railroads, you had 2,000 deaths recorded, 20,000 injuries. That's just in that 1 year. Very, very dangerous, very labor intensive. And, you think about, they're going through places like, the Rocky Mountains where already it's very harsh terrain, but, using things like dynamite to blast their way through mountains, very, very dangerous job. And then you pack in a lot of people, throughout history. I mean, this has been, pretty consistent where you have a lot of people living in small quarters. Disease often runs rampant, and that was the case with railroad workers as well. So besides just the environment that they had to deal with, they also had to deal with disease amongst themselves. I mentioned the Chinese in the last slide. One interesting thing was you actually had far less rates of Chinese dying due to disease than you did others because of some cultural traditions that they had. For instance, of course, drinking tea, very culturally aligned there. So, but to make tea, you have to boil the water. Well, now we know that that's killing off many of the germs that can be found in bad water. So, many of them didn't get sick like some of the others just because of the cultural happenstance there. But after the railroads were completed, for the most part, especially after the Transcontinental Railroad, you had basically these companies that were no longer competing for government contracts, and they fired most of their laborers, okay? And in particular, Chinese laborers found themselves left without a job. This kind of marks a change in how Americans view Chinese immigrants, and especially out west, it does start to combine into this view that because there are so many unemployed, that they are kind of seen as a drain on society. And so you start to have a nationwide push to try and limit and ban Chinese people from coming to this country. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later on. But in 1888, there will be a law passed called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which literally selected China and barred all immigration from there. So, in recent history, over the last few years, there have been calls to ban immigration from certain countries. And, there's a lot of discussion discussion that should be had about that, and especially the reasoning. In this case, I can tell you that the Chinese Exclusion Act definitely had a lot of racial foundations in that, and we got to make sure that we avoid those similar mistakes. So, it's important to obviously make parallels from yesteryear to things happening today. And, I've always looked at, the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's one of our more embarrassing moments for Congress to kind of take action against. Because on the other side of the country, on the East Coast, you just had immigrants coming in left and right. So, we specifically said we just did not want Chinese people. So one of the more embarrassing moments in U.S. history. Let's take a look at how the railroad did change and alter travel and trade in the United States. Before, if you had left the East Coast and you had traveled overland, you had taken, a carriage or whatnot, it would take you about 6 months. There's the old joke about, people traveling on the Oregon Trail. It took so long that, but between the people dying on the trail and the new babies being born, a whole new group would arrive in California than had actually left, from out east. That in some cases was the case because it took so long. But now with the railroads, a trip that took 6 months previously now takes 6 days. You just think about the impacts that's going to have on trade and the ability to do business, and not only that, but opening up the country for immigration within the nation. We're going to have people moving out west. This does help settle the West. One reason the government was interested in getting those contracts in place. So we have more movement of people than ever before, and that's a good thing. That's a positive thing. I did want to point out the map on the right-hand side. If you did not want to travel overland across the United States, you could go by boat. But remember, there's no Panama Canal. That will not exist until the early 1900s. So you actually had to go all the way around South America. And that journey itself took, I believe it was somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks, if memory serves me correctly. So either way, you're talking over a month of traveling to get from one side of the country to the other. And now it's less than a week. That is a monumental change in how goods and services and people are moving. It did have some impacts on the U.S. In various ways, things that you might not actually think about. Not only new towns, we talked about in our last lecture how places like Kansas City are on the map. The railroad was instrumental in that for a while. We were kind of the last line of the railroad. So you had all those cattle drives coming up to Kansas City, and you had kind of this major railroad hub that formed here. One thing that I think's interesting is the development of time zones. I know time zones are most important today to understand when your favorite television show is going to come on. Of course, that doesn't even matter now with, I guess, DVRing. But time zones are not created until the railroads. It's actually the railroad companies that help set those time zones because, it kind of goes back to the old, math problem of, what happens if you have a train traveling west on this track going 60 miles an hour, and you have a train traveling east on this track, what time do they crash into each other? Well, you can't have that, right? So time zones are very important to make sure that we are all set, that everyone is on the same schedule. Before it was really by the sun. And remember, most people are farmers at this time, so that makes sense. There really wasn't a strict focus on what time it was. It was more based off how much sunlight is left in the day. So business is going to be a little bit more succinct, but you think, this is one of those moments where I think about all the ramifications of this. You don't think like an invention like the railroad is going to affect how time is being encountered by human beings, but it absolutely does. So this is the beginning of our time zones right here. Now, with these railroads becoming bigger, and again, if you want to move your product anywhere, there's no trucks, there's no, carriages, you just can't put that much stuff, to be hauled by horses. That's one reason the Pony Express failed after less than a year. It's just hard to transfer large amounts of goods, but railroads change all that. So basically, anybody that wants to sell anything, you got to use the railroad at some point in that process. So you have millions upon millions of dollars. This is quickly. I mean, this is the booming industry of this early economy, and with that money, with increased money, wealth coming in, sadly, it often does lead to corruption and political corruption as well. One of the worst scandals in American history was called the Credit Mobilier scandal. And basically what happened here was you had the Union Pacific Railroad Company, which was, they had kind of subsidiary companies that they owned that helped operate, their business. Well, one of those was a construction company. And so basically they would pay this kind of subsidiary of theirs to build railroad lines. Well, again, they were using tax dollars to do that. The government was paying them to do that. Well, come to find out, what was happening was they were reporting more lines, and they were reporting higher costs associated with constructing those, when in reality it was a lot less. So I gave you some numbers here. The railroad lines that they actually constructed cost $53 million, but they charged the taxpayers $72 million. Now, that leaves a difference of $19 million, and you can imagine where that extra money went, directly into the pocketbooks of those in charge of that company. It was found out eventually that they were overcharging the taxpayers, and it turned into a bigger scandal by dozens of congressmen being bribed by the Union Pacific Railroad line. In fact, it went all the way up to the White House, where you had people in the administration covering this scandal up because they were getting a kickback, part of this $19 million. In fact, President Grant, famous Civil War general who took over after Johnson was impeached, or excuse me, he wasn't impeached, but he was partially impeached. But he took over after Johnson, and that is his biggest legacy with his presidential administration, was this scandal and his inability to get rid of corruption. And I should mention that most historians, as far as my knowledge is concerned, most historians don't necessarily look at Grant as being corrupt himself, but he definitely had a lot of people in his White House that were corrupt, that were dealing with these big businesses and taking bribes. So kind of a sad reality that, with more power, more influence, the money follows all that, and you often have more corruption. And that was the case even here with this early technology. Now, by 1893, fast forwarding, right, the transcontinental rail line has been present for about 25 years at this point. These railroad companies are getting bigger and bigger. This what we call the bubble is building. And before I explain the Panic of 1893, I want to tell you about what happened in the early 2000s, because there was what we call the dot-com bubble. And I vividly remember this, because you started hearing about all these success stories, these websites, that eBay.com, Amazon.com, these websites that just seem overnight like they were worth $1 billion, and people are saying, I got to get in on this, right? I mean, I gotta invest my money, and so you had just tons of money flowing into websites that, frankly, may not have been really good companies. And in particular, there was one website I remember, in fact, they had just been created, but they bought a Super Bowl commercial. It was Pets.com. And I remember Pets.com, they had this, I think, like a little sock puppet spokesman, which maybe that should have told you something. But I remember seeing that, thinking, man, that's a brand new website. Like, how can they afford to, advertise it at literally the most expensive time possible? And that was an example of one company that, they maybe didn't have the best business model, but it didn't matter because people were throwing money in left and right into these websites. Well, eventually Pets.com, the bubble burst, and websites like that really weren't using their money well, they ended up folding, and all those investors that had pumped money into those potential gold mines, they realized that their money was gone, and that when that .com bubble burst, you still had those strongholds like eBay and Amazon that were still holding on, but a lot of the money that had been invested just thrown at companies with really without much business history at all, it was gone, and those investors panicked. In 1893, basically the same thing happens. Again, history, kind of repeating itself there in the early 2000s. But in 1893, railroad was the big thing, right? You got to throw your money in railroads. It's a surefire bet. For decades at this point, people that had been pumping money into railroad businesses had gotten rich. I mean, the wealthiest Americans, at this time were all railroad moguls, and we'll talk about them in our next lecture. But basically by 1893, you had a couple things happen. You had pressure because not only corruption like Credit Mobilier, but frankly overbuilding. Some of these railroad companies were laying down line and then never even using it. So you had overbuilding and frankly just more competition that caused some of these railroads to go bankrupt. And once a few big ones started going bankrupt, you basically had this bubble burst, and all these investors who thought railroads were a surefire thing ended up losing their money. Look at the effects of this panic. So once people start selling off the investments and what little they had left, by the end of it was the worst economic depression up to that time. And there would be over 600 banks closed and 15,000 businesses failing. Again, usually when these bubbles burst, it's not just those industries that are kind of at the center of it, the railroad industry, but you think about all the other businesses that exist to kind of support and prop up the railroad industry, whether it's, companies that make boxes, that you stuff your goods in and then put on the railroad. There's all these companies that exist that kind of support these major industries. And when the major industries collapse, those other businesses fold. And, I'm not making any predictions here. I hope that I'm wrong in this, but I think right now we're starting to see some major, waves in the economy over coronavirus. And, I think that's going to be something we need to pay attention to over the next few months because a lot of these major just even ways that we buy and sell goods, restaurants, these things are starting to collapse, and so. We need to make sure that we're learning the lessons from previous and make sure that we're making good investments with our money. 3 million people lost their jobs, and that might not sound like much today, but remember 1893, the population's not nearly what it is today. So, my guess, in 1893, I would say that we would probably have, maybe 90 million people at that time. So if that's the case, I mean, you're looking at, probably about 5% of the population losing their jobs within the matter of a few weeks. But with every crisis is opportunity. And with 1893, many of those entrepreneurs that already, most of them being kind of these very wealthy men, often from either railroads themselves, but sometimes other industries. Vanderbilt, he's going to be one. Vanderbilt actually made his first money with steamships. That was kind of the first big wave of how to transport goods, was using rivers and canals, via steamship. Well, he made a ton of money in steamship and basically dropped everything because he knew that railroads were going to be the next big thing. We're going to talk more about him in our next lecture. But basically these guys who are already, extremely wealthy, they end up buying up all these failed railroad companies. So you look at the map on the bottom left, you can see all these railroad lines. By 1900, so many railroad companies have collapsed, and these few guys start buying up all these failed railroad companies. Well, what it leaves us with in 1900s is that all of those railroad lines, almost all of them, are controlled by just 7 companies. Okay? That is going to lead some major problems down the road, right? Because if you have, all of this wealth in the hands of very few individuals, you better hope that they don't get too greedy with, charging rates and all that, because this is what we call, monopolies. And, when one person controls an entire industry, the entire society is kind of basically held ransom. I mean, if they want to increase costs by double, they can do it. It's theirs. And, basically if you want to use the railroads, then you got to pay that fee. So we'll talk a little bit more about monopolies later on, but this is the beginning of some of these railroad monopolies. And ultra wealthy. I mean, we're talking about guys with Jeff Bezos money. So we're going to get to them in our next lecture. The final part I'll leave you with here is actually, I tell you what, we're going to time out. We got 25 minutes on the clock here, so we'll go ahead and leave this part for our next lecture, guys. If you, as always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to shoot me an email, and I will get back to you. This is not my favorite way of doing lectures, but it's the best we got for right now. So hopefully you identified some questions that you would like have answered. Please shoot me an email with those, and I would be happy to get back to you. Hope you guys have a great week. Thanks.